Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 28th of November 2018 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on the screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now this particular article appears in the editorial page number 8. The title of the article is Breathing Space. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Economy under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues. As you all know, the international crude oil prices were increasing during the last 6 to 8 months. However, since October 2018, there has been decline in their prices. It is in this particular aspect, this particular article mainly focuses on two aspects. Firstly, it highlights the reasons for the decline in the crude oil prices, and secondly, it highlights the benefit of the decline in the crude oil prices on the Indian economy. So as part of this video analysis, let us focus on these two aspects of the article. Since October 2018, there has been approximately 30% decline in the international crude oil prices. And as you can see in this particular graph, at the start of October 2018, 1 barrel of international crude oil was approximately around $85, but now it has dropped down to around $65. So there has been overall 30% decline in the international crude oil prices. In this context, let us try to understand as to what are the main reasons for the decline in the international crude oil prices. You should note here that the price of international crude oil is mainly determined by the two factors, that is the demand side factor and the supply side factor. Hence, accordingly, whenever there is a decrease in the demand and increase in the supply of international crude oil, automatically their prices would come down. It is in this particular aspect, let us try to understand as to why has demand and the supply of the crude oil has changed. Now the demand for the international crude oil has reduced because of the drop in the global demand, and this can be attributed to the concerns of the lower economic growth, particularly in major economies such as China. So this particular article highlights that as a major economy such as China faces slowdown, the demand for the international crude oil would reduce, leading to the decrease in their prices. Now coming to the supply side factors. Now the supply of the international crude oil has increased mainly on two accounts. Firstly, there has been drastic increase in the crude oil production, particularly by USA and Saudi Arabia. Further, it is to be noted that this particular article makes a special mention of USA, which has emerged as one of the largest producers of the crude oil. So because of the increase in the crude oil production by US and Saudi Arabia, the supply of the crude oil has increased, leading to decrease in their prices. And the second reason being, US has so far been soft with respect to Iranian nuclear sanctions. And as we know, US has given certain leeway to countries such as India, Japan, etc. to continue to import oil from Iran. It is in this particular aspect, because of this, the supply glut which otherwise would have been faced by the global economy has been avoided because of the US soft stance on Iranian sanctions. It is on account of these reasons the international crude oil prices has reduced by almost 30%. In this regard, let us look at what benefits the decline in the crude oil prices would have on the Indian economy. Now, India is among the top 3 importers of the crude oil across the world, wherein the imported crude oil accounts for almost 80% of its domestic needs. So any decline in the international crude oil prices would have immense benefits on the Indian economy. And these benefits may include the reduction in the current account deficit as well as the fiscal deficit. Now the current account deficit reduces because India would be required to pay lesser money for importing the crude oil. And the fiscal deficit reduces because the government would be required to spend less amount of money on various subsidies such as LPG, kerosene, etc. So because of these two reasons, whenever the international crude oil prices reduces, the current account deficit as well as the fiscal deficit reduces. Further, you need to note that a 10% decline in the international crude oil prices leads to reduction in the current account deficit by 0.5% and the reduction in the fiscal deficit by 0.1%. And as we have discussed in one of the earlier DNS video, both current account deficit as well as the fiscal deficit are referred to as the twin deficits. So one can clearly say that whenever there is a decline in the international crude oil prices, there would be decline in the twin deficits of India. The second benefit of the decline in the crude oil prices would be India would be now required to spend less amount of dollars to import the crude oil. For example, to import 1 barrel of crude oil, earlier India had to pay $85 per barrel. But now because of the decline in the crude oil prices, we would be required to pay approximately $60 per barrel. Now because of which we would be required to spend less amount of dollars to import the crude oil, and this would lead to the decrease in the dollar demand in the domestic economy, because of which the value of dollar vis-a-vis rupee reduces, and hence whenever the international crude oil prices decline, the value of rupee undergoes appreciation. On the contrary, whenever the international crude oil prices increases, the value of the rupee undergoes depreciation. And thirdly, it is to be noted that the crude oil is considered to be a critical input for many sectors in our economy, such as the crude oil is being used for generation of electricity, it is used in the transportation sector, etc. So whenever the international crude oil prices increases, this would lead to the inflation in the Indian economy. For example, increase in the transportation cost would lead to increase in the prices of the fruits and vegetables. Hence, we can clearly see that whenever the international crude oil prices increases, it can lead to the imported inflation in the Indian economy. So the third benefit of the decline in the crude oil prices is that it would avoid the risk of the imported inflation in the Indian economy. In spite of these benefits to the Indian economy, this particular article has highlighted certain concerns with respect to the decline in the international crude oil prices. The article here highlights that presently there is volatility in the international crude oil prices, which means to say one cannot guarantee that the international crude oil prices would continue to remain at a lower level, and there is an expectation that the international crude oil prices may even increase in future. This is because the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries has scheduled a meeting which is supposed to take place on December 6th, and during this meeting the OPEC countries are set to discuss on the production cuts. So if in case the OPEC countries decide to cut down on their production of the crude oil, their prices in future may increase. Hence one can say that India has a temporary window to capitalize on the decline in the crude oil prices and prepare itself for any future increase in their prices. So these are some of the aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. So based on the discussion which we had so far, this would be a prelims question for the practice. You can pause this video and try to solve this question. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, the decline in the international crude oil prices would lead to which among the following? The first one is reduction in the twin deficits of India. And as we have discussed, the twin deficits here refer to the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit. And whenever the international crude oil prices reduces, the twin deficits in India also reduce. So this particular statement is correct. The second one says depreciation in the value of rupee. Now this is wrong because whenever the international crude oil prices reduces, the value of the rupee undergoes appreciation and not depreciation. The third one is increase in the rate of inflation. This is wrong because as we have discussed, whenever there is a decline in the international crude oil prices, the rate of inflation in India reduces. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is A, that is one only. So having analyzed all the aspects related to this particular article, let us now move to the next article. Now this particular article appears on page number 13 of the business section. The title of the article is NPAs on downhill path since March peak, says RBI. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Economy under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because recently the Reserve Bank of India has submitted a document to the Standing Committee on Finance. Now in this particular document, the RBI has highlighted that between March to September 2018, there has been decrease in the gross non-performing assets, the net non-performing assets as well as the slippage ratio of the Indian banks. And accordingly, this particular article has highlighted facts and figures with respect to the decrease in these parameters. The facts and figures which have been highlighted in this particular article with respect to decrease in these parameters are not important from the exam perspective. However, what you are required to know with respect to your prelims examination is the difference between the gross NPA and the net NPA, and also the concept of the slippage ratio. So as part of this video analysis, we will basically focus on these aspects. So let us understand the difference between the gross NPA and the net NPA first, and then we'll look at the concept of the slippage ratio. Now, as most of you know, NPA is a loan on which the interest or the installment of the principal remains due for a specified period of time. And according to the RBI guidelines, the loan has to be categorized as NPA if the interest or the installment of principal has remained due for a period greater than 90 days. Which means to say simply, if a loan is outstanding for a period greater than 90 days, automatically the banks are required to classify that loan as a non-performing asset. So based on that, the gross NPA is calculated as the total amount of NPAs of a bank divided by the total loans given by them. Which means that if a gross NPA of a bank is 8%, it means that out of 100 rupees given in the form of loans, 8 rupees is in the form of NPA. Further, you need to note that as per the RBI guidelines, the NPAs are categorized into three types. These being the substandard assets, doubtful assets and loss assets. And this categorization of NPAs is based upon the period for which the loan is due. For example, the substandard assets are those NPAs which are due for a period greater than 90 days and less than 12 months, that is 1 year. Whereas the doubtful assets are those NPAs which are due for a period greater than 12 months, that is 1 year. And when it comes to the loss assets are those assets which are recognized by the auditors of the bank or that of the RBI. But these assets have so far not been written off from the bank books. Further, as you know, the provisioning norms refer to the fact that the bank had to set aside certain amount of capital in order to withstand the loss which may arise due to NPAs. And accordingly, for different categories of these NPAs, the RBI had laid down the provisioning norms. For example, for the substandard assets, the banks have to set aside at least 15% of the total outstanding loan as a provisioning. For the doubtful assets, it is 25% of the outstanding loan. Further, you need to note that the provisioning norms here progressively would increase with the increase in the tenure, which means that as the loan continues to remain a doubtful asset for a longer period of time, the provisioning norms for such banks would also increase progressively. And when it comes to loss assets, the provisioning norms right now is 100% of the total outstanding loan. So based on this understanding, coming to the concept of the net NPA, now the net NPA of the bank is calculated as the total gross non-performing assets minus the total amount of capital set aside for the provisioning norms. So based on the understanding of gross and net NPA, we can come to a conclusion that the gross non-performing asset of a bank indicates the asset quality of a bank. On the other hand, the net NPA indicates the total burden of the bank, which means that if the net NPA of a bank is higher, the bank would be required to maintain higher provisioning norms, which can be considered to be a form of burden. Now coming to the concept of the slippage ratio. Now the slippage ratio here refers to the percentage of fresh NPAs which is expressed in terms of the percentage of loans given from the beginning of a quarter in a financial year. To understand this concept of slippage ratio, let's look at an example. Let's say in the first quarter of a financial year, starting from March to May, a particular bank has given a total loans of 100 rupees. And out of this 100 rupees, rupees 10 has been categorized as a non-performing asset. So in this case, the slippage ratio for this particular bank for this particular quarter would be 10%. So one main difference between the gross non-performing asset and the slippage ratio is that the gross non-performing asset would take into account the accumulated non-performing assets. On the other hand, the slippage ratio takes into account the non-performing assets for a particular quarter and not the accumulated non-performing assets. So these are some of the aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. So based on the discussion which we had so far, this would be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find the answer to this question. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements related to the non-performing assets. The first statement is, the net NP of a bank is calculated by deducting the provisioning amount from the gross NPA. And as we have discussed, this particular statement is right since the formula for the net NPA is gross NPA minus the provisioning amount. Now coming to the second statement reads as the slippage ratio of a bank takes into account the accumulated NPAs of a bank. Now this particular statement is wrong. This is because as we have discussed, the slippage ratio takes into account the NPAs of a bank for a particular quarter and not the accumulated NPAs. The accumulated NPAs of a bank are taken into account for calculating the gross NPA. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is A, that is 1 only. With this, let us now move to the next article. The next article appears on page number 7. The title of the article is A Shot in the Arm for the Defense IPRs. This particular article shall be mainly important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Current Events of National Importance. Now, this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because the Ministry of Defense has launched a new mission known as Raksha Gyan Shakti, and this particular mission is mainly launched in order to promote the innovation in the defense technology through the filing of the intellectual property rights, that is the patents. So as part of this video analysis, we shall basically focus on 3 aspects. Firstly, we'll understand as to what is the need for launching this mission, the idea behind the mission, and lastly, we'll look into the objectives of the mission. Let us start covering these aspects of the article one by one. Now coming to the need for the mission, presently there is an international agreement under the World Trade Organization known as TRIPS, which stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. This particular international agreement provides for a framework for the protection of intellectual property rights across the world. However, it is to be noted that presently in India, there is lack of awareness on this particular modern legal framework for the IPRs. And because of this lack of awareness, we are not being able to utilize our knowledge and creativity to the optimum. So it is in this particular aspect, this particular mission launched by the Defense Ministry aims to build up the awareness on the modern legal framework so as to improve the filing of intellectual property rights by the Defense Ministry. Further, as you know, India is one of the largest importer of the defense goods, wherein India mainly import defense goods from countries such as Russia, Israel and USA. It is in this particular aspect there is a need to develop the self-reliance in the defense technology, through which India can become a net exporter of defense goods rather than relying on the import of defense goods. So the idea behind this particular mission is to train the employees of the defense PSUs such as the DRDO in order to promote the culture of innovation and to increase the number of patent filings in the field of defense technology. And the nodal agency for this mission is the Directorate General Quality Assurance. It is to be noted that this particular agency works under the Ministry of Defense. Further, a separate Intellectual Property Facilitation Center has already been created in the Ministry of Defense. Now under this mission, the targets have already been set for the year 2018. And the target is to train 10,000 defense personnel working in various defense PSUs such as the DRDO. And it also seeks to file at least 1,000 intellectual property rights. Now these are some of the aspects which one should know with respect to this particular mission. So based on the discussion which we had so far, this would be a prelims question for the practice. You can pause this video and try to find answer to this question. We will discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements related to the Raksha Gyan Shakti. The first statement reads as, this mission has been launched to promote the culture of innovation in the defense technology through the filing of intellectual property rights. Now as we have discussed, this particular statement is right. Now the second statement reads as, the nodal agency for this mission is Defense Research Development Organization, that is DRDO. Now this particular statement is wrong because as we have discussed, the nodal agency for this mission is the Directorate General Quality Assurance. Hence looking at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is B, that is 2 only. So having analyzed all the aspects related to this particular article, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 7. The title of the article is ISRO's Imaging Satellite HysIS is all set for the Thursday launch. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Current Events of National Importance as well as General Science and Technology. Now, this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because ISRO is set to launch India's first hyperspectral imaging satellite. The name of the satellite is HysIS. This particular satellite is said to be launched by using the PSLV C-43. This hyperspectral imaging satellite is going to be an advanced Earth observation satellite in order to study the Earth's surface. So as part of this video analysis, we shall basically focus on three aspects. Firstly, we'll understand the evolving technology of the hyperspectral imaging. Secondly, we'll look into the details related to HysIS satellite. And thirdly, we'll look into the applications of the satellite. Let us start analyzing these three aspects of the article one by one. Now coming to the concept of the hyperspectral imaging technology. Now this particular technology to be used by ISRO combines the power of the digital imaging with that of the spectroscopy. Now what this means is once the images are captured by using digital imaging, these images are then analyzed by using the field of the spectroscopy in order to identify the objects on the Earth's surface. Hence this particular technology enables us to collect information from the Earth's surface by using the electromagnetic spectrum. And for this, ISRO is using optical imaging detector chips. And these chips can identify 55 different spectra. And the most important aspect which you should note with respect to this particular technology is that unlike the regular or the optical remote sensing cameras, this particular technology enables us to have a distinct identification of the objects, materials as well as the processes on the Earth. Hence, we'll be able to observe the objects on the Earth more clearly as compared to the cameras used in the remote sensing satellites. Hence, we'll be able to identify the objects on the Earth far more clearly than the regular optical or remote sensing cameras. Hence, because of its ability to clearly identify the objects, materials and processes on the Earth, it is also referred to as the eye in the sky. Further, the launch of this particular satellite is considered to be a remarkable achievement for ISRO because this particular technology is still evolving and very few space agencies across the world have launched such satellites. Now coming to the details about the HysIS satellite, this particular satellite is said to be placed in a sun-synchronous orbit at a height of 636 km from the Earth's surface. And this particular satellite is said to have a lifetime of 5 years. And as discussed, the main goal of this particular satellite is to study the Earth's surface in the visible and the infrared region of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now coming to the applications of this satellite. Now this particular satellite is said to have innumerable applications. Some of these applications include the study of Earth's atmosphere, mapping of minerals on the Earth's surface, and this particular satellite can also be used in the field of agriculture, defense as well as the land use mapping. Now these are some of the aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. So based on the discussion which we had so far, this would be a prelims question for the practice. You can pause this video and try to find answer to this question. We will discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements related to the HysIS satellite. The first statement reads as, it is based on new evolving technology known as the hyperspectral imaging, which can be used for both communication technology as well as advanced Earth observation. Now, as we have discussed, this particular technology is to be used for the advanced Earth observation and not for the communications technology. Hence, this particular statement is wrong. The second statement reads as, unlike the remote sensing cameras, this satellite can more clearly identify the objects on the Earth's surface. And as we have discussed, this particular statement is right. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is B, that is 2 only. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now this particular article appears as a lead article on page number 8. The title of the article is Lessons from a Tragedy. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 2 under the subsection Governance as well as Social Justice. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the recent death of the American journalist by the North Sentinel tribal community. It is in this particular regard, the article highlights that the death of the American journalist raises serious concerns about the tribal welfare policies of the government. Further, it argues that the tribals in India should have to remain undisturbed and they should not be forced to get assimilated into the mainstream society. Now, this particular article basically focuses on 3 different aspects. Firstly, it tries to identify the reasons for hostility of the Sentinelist tribe. Secondly, it identifies the problems with respect to protection of these tribals. And thirdly, it identifies the reasons for the vulnerability of these tribals to intrusions. So as part of this video analysis, let us start discussing these aspects of the article one by one. Now coming to the reasons for the hostility of the Sentinelist tribe. Now to explain the reasons for this hostility of these tribes, there are two different viewpoints. The first viewpoint is that the tribes are hostile because of their primitive nature, which means that the hostility of the tribes has born out of their primitive nature. And the other viewpoint is that the hostility of the tribes is not on account of the primitive nature, rather it is on account of their previous experience of being suppressed and subjugated by the external elements. It is in this particular regard, the article clearly highlights that the hostility of these tribal groups is not attributed to their primitive nature. Rather, the hostility can be attributed to their previous experiences of being suppressed and subjugated by the external elements. In this regard, let us try to understand as to why does the article say that the hostility of the Sentinelist tribe is because of their previous experience of suppressed and subjugated. Firstly, this particular article highlights that the tribal groups have not been hostile to all the forms of interactions. They become hostile only when they feel that they are being suppressed or subjugated. For example, this particular article highlights that when the government sent its contact parties to reach out to these tribals received gifts from these government contact parties such as the banana, coconut, etc. Which means that in this particular case, they were not hostile. Further, this particular article also highlights that these tribals use iron for making the arrow blades and also use glass beads, which shows that these tribals are not completely isolated and must have got these things from their outside interaction. In this regard, the article highlights that the interaction of these tribal communities with the external elements depend upon the safety of the interaction, which means that if the tribals feel safe by interacting with external element, in such cases, normally the tribals do not become hostile. However, the tribals could become hostile in order to ensure their survival and in order to keep away themselves from the perceived danger. Hence, as discussed, normally these tribes are not hostile with respect to their external interaction. However, they become hostile only when they perceive a danger from these external elements. Now let us look at the second aspect of the article, which highlights the problems with respect to the protection of these tribal communities. Now, as you know, these tribals have a very primitive way of living. Hence, they become a considerable source of interest for the tourist. And because of this, the tourists breach the law and undermine the protective cover given to these tribals. For example, the American journalist who was killed recently tried to contact these tribes in spite of the protective cover given to them. And secondly, it can also be highlighted that the government has been quite ineffective in the implementation of the tribal protection policy. Now coming to the third aspect of the article as to why the tribes of the Andaman and Nicobar are vulnerable to the intrusion. Now this particular article highlights that the Indian government has used the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to settle its population, and this was particularly used by the Indian government as part of the refugee rehabilitation scheme after the India's partition. So the government's implementation of the refugee rehabilitation scheme has led to the influx of the outsiders into Andaman and Nicobar Islands, making these tribal groups more vulnerable. Further, the article also highlights that over a period of time, the Indian government has initiated a large number of development projects such as construction of roads. And because of these development projects, the tribal groups of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands have become more vulnerable. It is in this regard, the article concludes by saying that there is a need for holistic development of Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and such a holistic development has to keep in mind the interests of the tribal groups. Now, these are some of the aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us look at the question for the day.